Wild places can turn deadly in an instant, and when predators encounter humans, the results are unforgettable. In this video, you'll witness 6 terrifying encounters, from a black bear rampaging through a Colorado concert crowd to a crowded Carpathian mountain cable car platform. Are you ready to face the wild? On June 9th, 2025, 7 friends pitched their tents near a salmon stream deep within the wilderness of Kodiak Island, Alaska, unaware that the night ahead would become a nightmare of violence and loss that none could have imagined. The group had been traveling together for days, carrying gear through rugged country, eager for the kind of wild adventure that only Alaska could offer. And although their muscles ached, their supplies had grown lighter, their spirits had remained high as they built a fire that evening, cooked what food they had left, and laughed under the fading northern light. Among them were Ethan Calloway, a confident and steady man who had organized the trip, Marisol Vega, whose energy and enthusiasm seemed to lift everyone's mood, Thomas Novak, practical and strong, Jenna Price, curious and adventurous, Lucas Hart, quiet but dependable, Riley Donovan, restless and bold, and Sophie Blake, who had brought along her dog Coda, a loyal companion with a keen nose and unshakable presence. The stream beside their camp ran clear and cold, carrying salmon upriver with endless determination, and with the surrounding spruce and alders pressing in, the setting was wild and untamed, a place far removed from the safety of towns and roads. It was a place that belonged to bears, especially the Kodiak, massive and powerful, capable of weighing over 1,000 pounds, and known to follow the salmon during this season. And though the group had known that fact in theory, the reality of what it meant to share the land with such a predator was something they had not yet confronted. They had placed their food in containers near the tents rather than hauling it further away, a mistake born of fatigue and inexperience. Though Coda barked briefly into the dark woods as night fell, the campers reassured themselves that it was nothing. By midnight, the air was still, the fire reduced to embers, and all 7 lay in their tents, cocooned in sleeping bags, lulled by exhaustion and the faint sound of running water, while Coda stirred restlessly, ears twitching at a smell drifting through the trees. From the blackness beyond camp, a shadow heavier than the night itself moved with deliberate steps, drawn by the lingering scent of fish and human presence. The Kodiak bear, immense and hungry, pushed closer, its claws sinking into damp soil, its breath steaming in the cold air, until the thin fabric of the tents stood between predator and prey. The first sound was a tearing rip, as canvas shredded under the massive paws, followed by the panicked cries of campers startled from sleep as the beast crashed into the camp with terrifying speed, scattering gear and snapping poles like twigs. Ethan barely had time to rise before the weight of the bear's paw came down with crushing force, ending him in an instant, while Marisol screamed as her tent collapsed under the assault. Her cries cut short in the chaos. Tomas fought to scramble free, but the bear's jaws closed on him, dragging him aside as the others tried in desperation to escape the collapsing shelter that had turned into a trap. Jenna and Lucas, caught in the confusion, were struck down before they could find the opening of their tent, their bodies shredded as the bear swiped again and again, its frenzy only heightened by the smell of blood. Riley burst out into the open, running for the trees, but he stumbled on the uneven ground, and the Kodiak overtook him, striking with a blow that silenced him as swiftly as it had the others. Sophie, trapped in her tent, felt the canvas collapsing and smelled the blood in the air, her heart hammering so loudly it seemed it would burst from her chest. But before the bear reached her, Coda hurled himself forward, teeth flashing and claws tearing at the predator's fur. The dog barked with desperate fury, leaping at the enormous bear, snapping at its legs, forcing the beast to turn its attention away for a moment, giving Sophie the chance she needed to claw her way out of the tangled fabric and stumble barefoot across the rocks. The bear swatted Coda aside with a brutal strike, sending the loyal animal tumbling to the ground. Yet Coda rose again, battered but determined, throwing himself once more at the monster that threatened his owner. His defiance was brave but brief, as the bear struck him again with such force that his body crumpled, lifeless, and the ground around him darkened with blood. Sophie scrambled toward the edge of camp, driven by terror and instinct, climbing onto a nearby boulder slick with moss, her hands gripping the stones so tightly her fingers tore. From that perch, she looked back, her chest heaving, her throat raw with sobs, as the bear rampaged through the ruins of camp, its massive form moving among the torn tents and broken bodies, the sound of its breathing filling the night. She stayed frozen there, trembling, too afraid to move, watching every shadow, convinced that each shift in the dark meant the beast had found her again, until exhaustion forced her eyes closed as the first light of dawn touched the trees. When she finally climbed down at sunrise, the camp was silent but for the stream, the air heavy with the smell of blood and the ruins of what had once been a place of laughter. 6 of her friends lay dead. Their lives ended in violent moments that had shattered the bonds of their group, and near them was Koda, his body still, his sacrifice etched forever in Sophie's memory as the reason she still drew breath. The bear had vanished back into the forest, leaving behind nothing but carnage and silence, its presence as ghostly as it was devastating. Sophie staggered through the wreckage, her body weak, her mind numb, each step heavy with grief as she understood the finality of what had happened. As she looked once more at the body of the dog that had saved her, she felt both sorrow and gratitude, for in the heart of the wilderness where strength alone often decided who survived, loyalty and love had made the difference between life and death. In October 2024, as the first snow of the season dusted the endless forests of Russia's Amur region, 2 lifelong friends shouldered their rifles and pushed deeper into the wilderness in search of elk, their breath clouding in the cold air and their boots crunching over the frozen ground. Dmitry Volkov, broad-shouldered and steady, had spent years hunting in these woods. At the same time, Ilya Petrenko, lean and sharp-eyed, shared his passion for the challenge of the chase and the quiet companionship that came with hours of silence in a land where only the wind and the calls of distant birds broke the stillness. The Amur forest stretched endlessly around them, a labyrinth of towering pines, birches, and frozen undergrowth, with shadows that lingered even during daylight hours, creating a sense that predators could be watching from just beyond sight. The early snow had painted the land in white, and against this backdrop, fresh elk tracks stood out clearly, leading the men further into the timber, their hearts quickening with the knowledge that the hunt was drawing them closer to their prize. Hours passed before the shapes of the animals finally emerged through the trees, and as the 2 hunters moved into position, their discipline and patience paid off. Dmitri's shot rang out, striking a large stag cleanly, the animal collapsing to the ground as the rest of the herd scattered into the trees. Kneeling beside their kill, the men began field dressing the animal with practiced hands, their knives flashing as they worked quickly to remove the hide and organs, eager to finish before the light faded completely. The metallic scent of blood rose sharply into the cold air, carried on the wind. Though neither hunter noticed immediately, the odor traveled far through the forest, awakening instincts far older and stronger than their own. Somewhere in the shadows, a Russian grizzly stirred, massive and restless after weeks of building fat reserves before winter's full grip, its hunger sharpened by the promise of an easy meal. The bear moved silently at first, its paws sinking into the snow without sound, its eyes fixed on the men bent low over their kill, unaware that danger crept closer with every step. Then, with a suddenness that shattered the silence of the forest, the grizzly exploded from the trees, its enormous body crashing through the brush with terrifying force, scattering snow, branches, and the men's gear in every direction. Dmitry barely had time to rise, his knife slipping from his hand as the beast closed the distance in seconds, while Ilya, caught in shock, fumbled to raise his rifle. The shot cracked, echoing through the forest, and the bullet grazed the bear's shoulder, tearing fur and flesh but doing little to slow its charge. The wound only enraged the animal further. Its roar shook the trees as it reared onto its hind legs, towering above the men before dropping with a bone-shaking impact into the snow, its eyes burning with fury. In a single swipe of its massive paw, the grizzly struck Ilya aside, the blow breaking his arm with a sickening snap and hurling him against a snowbank, where he crumpled, dazed and bleeding, the breath ripped from his lungs. Dmitry stood frozen for a heartbeat, his instincts screaming to act, but his body was too slow against the sheer force of nature bearing down upon him. The bear lunged, its claws sinking into his chest as it drove him backward into the snow, pinning him with crushing weight that pressed the air from his lungs. His scream tore through the forest, echoing in the silence between the trees, a sound of pure terror and agony as the beast's jaws closed around his neck and chest, shaking him with brutal violence. Blood sprayed across the snow, dark against the white, and Dimitri's cries faltered as the bear mauled him again and again, tearing through flesh and bone with a savagery that left no room for escape. Ilya, half conscious and racked with pain, forced his eyes open to the horror unfolding before him, his friend pinned beneath the predator, his rifle lying just beyond reach in the trampled snow. Every attempt to move sent waves of agony through his broken arm and ribs, leaving him helpless, forced to watch as the creature tore into the man he had called a brother for decades. His voice broke into hoarse sobs, yet no sound could stop the carnage, and no strength remained in his body to rise and intervene. The attack stretched on in terrible minutes that felt endless, the grizzly's roars mingling with Dimitri's final cries until, at last, silence fell once more, broken only by the ragged sound of the bear's breath as it stood over its kill. Blood coated its fur, steam rising from its mouth as it turned its massive head, scanning the snowbank where Ilya lay trembling, his body too broken to rise. For a moment their eyes met, man and beast locked in a terrible recognition of survival and death, before the grizzly snorted, dismissing him as too weak to be worth its effort, and lumbered back into the trees, vanishing as suddenly as it had come. The silence that followed was heavier than the attack itself, the forest pressing in around Ilya as he lay helpless beside the body of his oldest friend, frost creeping into his skin, and shock wrapping him in numbness. Hours passed, each one colder than the last, until search teams finally found him at dawn, drawn by reports of hunters who had failed to return. They discovered him collapsed beside the remains of the camp, his skin pale, his lips blue, his eyes glazed with exhaustion, yet his chest still rose with shallow breaths. Dimitri's body lay near the blood-stained snow, a grim reminder of what had taken place. The rescuers carried Ilya out of the forest, frostbitten and barely conscious, his mind haunted by the screams that still echoed through the trees and the sight of the grizzly's fury, a vision that would never leave him. The death of his friend stood as a brutal reminder of nature's power, of how quickly the hunter could become the hunted, and of how thin the line was between the triumph of the chase and the silence of loss. On June 25, 2025, as the mountains of northern Montana began to shed the last traces of snow and the wilderness stirred with life, 2 park rangers set out on a backcountry patrol that would test the limits of their endurance and remind them of the dangers hidden within the Bob Marshall wilderness. Ethan Calder, steady and seasoned, and Maya Foster, sharp and resilient, had spent years protecting the vast forests and valleys of this untamed region, their work taking them to places far beyond the reach of roads or communication towers, where only experience, instinct, and trust in one another could keep them safe. The air was cool and thin, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, and the trail they followed wound narrowly between thick stands of timber, rising and falling with the contours of the rugged terrain. Their assignment was to inspect a remote elk monitoring station, one of many spread throughout the wilderness, to track the movements and health of herds that wandered the high meadows and valleys. The station had not been checked since winter, though the task itself was routine. The remoteness of its location meant that the rangers were completely on their own, days from the nearest ranger post, with no radios capable of reaching beyond the mountains that loomed on every horizon. Still, both knew the risks well and accepted them as part of the work, their training and familiarity with the land grounding them in the knowledge that preparation and vigilance were their strongest allies. As the two approached the clearing where the station stood, they moved with practiced awareness, eyes scanning for signs of recent wildlife activity, rifles slung on their backs, but hands close enough to act if needed. The metal structure of the monitoring station stood half hidden among the trees, its weathered frame streaked from months of snow and rain. Within it, the rangers found the supplies that had been stored months earlier, including bait intended to attract elk to the cameras and collection devices. What they did not realize was that the strong scent of that bait had been carried on the wind for days, drawing more than elk toward the remote site. The first sign came in the form of silence. The faint chatter of birds that had filled the forest vanished abruptly, replaced by a heaviness that seemed to press against their skin. Both rangers froze, their instincts warning them that something moved among the pines, Then, from between the shadows of the trees, a shape emerged, immense and deliberate, its fur matted from spring rains and its shoulders rolling with terrifying power. The grizzly, drawn by the scent of bait and human presence, stepped into view with slow precision, its head lowering as it studied the intruders. Its breath was visible in the cool air. Neither ranger moved at first, their bodies tense, their eyes locked on the animal that outweighed them a dozen times over. Yet before a plan could be made, the bear's hesitation shattered. With a roar that split the air and echoed against the timbered slopes, the grizzly dropped into a charge, its speed terrifying for its size as it thundered across the clearing, scattering branches and tearing through the undergrowth. Ethan reacted instantly, yanking the flare gun from his belt and firing into the brush just ahead of the bear. The red streak hissed as it burst in a spray of sparks and smoke, but the display only slowed the beast for a moment before it pushed forward with renewed fury. Maya was closest when the bear reached them, and though she twisted to avoid its first strike, the paw caught her across the back, tearing her jacket to shreds and leaving shallow but searing cuts that burned as she stumbled forward, her body slamming against the ground. Pain flared through her as she scrambled for cover, her hands clawing at the dirt until she dragged herself behind a massive fallen log, its moss-covered trunk providing the only barrier between her and the beast. Ethan had no time to reach for his rifle, the speed of the attack leaving him only seconds to act, so he seized the spare hiking pole strapped to his pack and thrust it forward with both hands, jabbing at the bear's snout and chest as it reared above him, claws raking at the ground. The thin aluminum bent under the force of each strike, but the desperate motion was enough to hold the animal back, the sharp thrusts landing against its fur, startling it just enough to keep it from pinning him to the ground. The clearing filled with the sounds of chaos, the bear's guttural roars and the snapping of branches mixing with Ethan's ragged breaths and Maya's cries of pain as she pressed herself lower against the log, her fingers digging into the bark, her blood smearing against the moss. The grizzly slammed against the fallen tree, sending vibrations through the wood as it clawed and pawed at the obstacle, trying to reach the ranger crouched just beyond its grasp. At the same time, Ethan darted to the side, shouting and striking again with the battered pole, each movement a gamble that the bear would turn toward him rather than toward Maya. For long, harrowing moments, the standoff stretched into what felt like hours, the rangers certain that the animal would not relent, their bodies straining under the weight of adrenaline and fear. Yet, as abruptly as it had begun, the fury seemed to ebb. The grizzly snorted and paced with heavy steps before pausing, its massive head turning toward the dark line of forest beyond the clearing. With a final huff, it swung its body back into the trees, disappearing into the shadows as swiftly as it had emerged, leaving only broken branches, claw marks, and the shredded remains of gear scattered across the ground. Silence returned, broken only by the labored breathing of the rangers, who remained frozen for several minutes, unable to trust that the danger had truly passed. Slowly, Ethan lowered the bent hiking pole, its end splintered from the force of his strikes, while Maya pulled herself upright from behind the log, her back burning with pain, her jacket shredded, and blood seeping from the shallow lacerations that crisscrossed her skin. They were alive, but the encounter had left its mark, not only in the wounds and bruises, but in the knowledge of how close they had come to being torn apart in the heart of the wilderness. As they packed their ruined gear and began the long hike back toward the distant post, every sound in the forest seemed sharper, every shadow heavier, the memory of the charging bear fresh in their minds. On August 4th, 2022, as the heat of the day faded into the cool of evening, hundreds of people gathered in a mountain amphitheater in Colorado for a summer folk concert, the kind of event where music blended with the whisper of pines and families spread blankets across the lawn while vendors sold food and drinks from stalls at the edges of the venue. The setting was idyllic, with the rugged peaks catching the last glow of sunlight, and the mood was one of celebration, as laughter rose into the air as performers tuned their instruments under strings of lanterns that swayed lightly in the breeze. Children played near the benches, couples shared coolers of food, and the audience settled into the simple rhythm of a night of live music under the stars. Yet this was bear country, a place where black bears roamed the forests in late summer, their instincts sharpened by the need to build fat before winter. Although precautions had been advised, the smell of grilled meat, spilled soda, and sweet desserts carried easily into the timber. Somewhere in the thick cover beyond the amphitheater, a black bear caught the scent, its keen nose pulling it toward the unnatural gathering of humans and the irresistible lure of food. The crowd had no idea that the night's harmony would soon give way to chaos, the natural order breaking violently into their world of lights and song. The first sign of trouble came in the form of movement at the edge of the trees, a dark shape emerging from the shadows as the last chords of a guitar echoed across the seats. At first, a few in the audience thought it was a dog that had strayed from a campsite. Still, the truth became clear in an instant, as the animal revealed its size, its heavy shoulders rolling forward as it loped onto the grass, eyes fixed on the rows of picnics and coolers that littered the lawn seating. The music halted abruptly as the black bear stormed the crowd, its paws tearing at blankets and splintering containers, its jaws snapping as people screamed and scrambled to escape the sudden intrusion. Coolers tipped and burst open as the animal shoved them aside, food scattering across the trampled grass. At the same time, panicked picnickers clutched children and sprinted for safety. Wooden benches creaked and cracked as the bear shoved past them, leaving deep claw marks gouged into the surfaces. The peaceful amphitheater transformed into a scene of fear in seconds. The sound of screams mingled with the crashing of overturned chairs and the frantic scuffle of boots against the ground, a storm of chaos tearing apart the calm of the night. Among the performers, guitarist Miles Kessler had been closest to the lawn when the bear charged, and as the predator swung toward him, he raised his instrument in a desperate act of defense. The guitar splintered under the blow of the bear's paw, wood cracking into jagged shards as the strings snapped violently, but the strike did not stop there. The claws raked across Miles's shoulder, tearing flesh and sending blood spraying across the stage lights, the musician staggering backward with a cry of pain as the animal pressed forward, its momentum unchecked. Security personnel rushed forward, waving their arms and shouting as they tried to steer the beast away from the densest parts of the crowd, while fans surged toward the stage in confusion. The exits clogged as hundreds tried to flee at once, and the rangers stationed nearby were too far to intervene quickly, leaving those closest to improvise in the moment. Vendors at the food stalls hurled folding chairs, plastic tubs, and anything within reach toward the animal, the objects clattering loudly against the ground, some bouncing off its thick fur and momentarily startling it, but never slowing its advance for long. The black bear wheeled toward the new distractions, tossing a cooler high into the air with a swing of its paw before slamming into the benches again, splinters flying across the grass. The crowd pressed harder toward the stage, stumbling over one another in the panic, and still the animal moved with determination, unwilling to abandon the feast it had scented. In desperation, one of the vendors sprinted to a roadside stand near the amphitheater where small fireworks were being sold for the weekend, seizing a bundle and rushing back to the field as the bear swung its head toward another cluster of people. With shaking hands, several of the volunteers lit the fireworks and hurled them upward, sparks bursting into the night sky as the sharp crackling and whistling filled the amphitheater. The air shimmered with red and green streaks as explosions popped overhead, and the noise startled the bear at last, its body jerking with alarm as it backed away from the unfamiliar thunder. The crowd froze in tense silence as the animal retreated step by step, its ears flattening against its head until it finally turned and lumbered back toward the trees, vanishing into the timber from which it had first come. For long minutes no one moved, the amphitheater holding its collective breath as though the beast might return at any moment, until the realization settled that the danger had passed. The field was left in ruin, coolers smashed, chairs overturned, blood staining the grass near the front rows, and claw marks carved deep into the wooden benches that had once seated laughing families. On the stage, Miles Kessler was carried away by paramedics, his shirt soaked crimson, his face pale but conscious, his broken guitar lying shattered among the debris. The music did not return that night. The instruments were left silent, the stage lights dimmed, and the audience dispersed in shocked quiet, their voices hushed as though speaking too loudly might invite the creature back. What had begun as a summer evening of song beneath the stars had ended with blood and chaos, a reminder that in the high country of Colorado, the wild was never far away, and even the safest-seeming gathering could be undone in seconds by the raw power of nature's hunger. The waters off Kodiak Island were calm that August afternoon in 2024, the tide rolling in smooth and steady as the four anglers worked the deck of their anchored boat, their hands slick with fish scales and blood as they cleaned a heavy catch of salmon that had filled their coolers. The air carried the briny smell of seawater, mixed with the strong odor of freshly gutted fish, a scent that drifted easily on the breeze and carried further across the coastline than they could have realized, pulling attention from somewhere they could not see. They were used to the island's rugged wilderness pressing in on them with its thick spruce and steep ridges, but being a few hundred yards offshore, they had thought themselves safe, confident that the dangers of Kodiak's immense bears belonged to the forests and riverbanks, not the swaying deck beneath their feet. Marcus Lee stood near the stern, his knife flashing in the late light as he worked quickly through the silver salmon, their flesh sliding across the table, while the others bagged fillets and stacked them into coolers. The men were tired but satisfied, lulled by the rhythm of their work, their voices carrying in short bursts over the drone of gulls overhead, until silence replaced their conversation when the youngest of them, Eric, pointed toward the waterline. At first it looked like little more than a floating log drifting in the current. Still, the movement was too direct, the ripples too steady, and when the shape drew closer, they saw the heavy brown head rising above the waves, the dark, wet fur slick against the broad muzzle, and the unmistakable size of a Kodiak bear swimming toward them with relentless strokes of its massive limbs. The moment fractured into chaos. One of the men rushed to the outboard motor, his trembling hands yanking the cord, but the engine coughed, sputtered, and fell silent, refusing to turn over even as panic surged across the deck. The others scrambled to clear knives and rods, knowing there was no chance to outrun what was closing on them. Marcus gripped the rail, his breath shallow as he watched the bear's enormous body slice through the water with frightening speed, the muscles beneath its sodden fur pushing it forward until its bulk collided with the stern in a violent thud that jolted the entire vessel. The boat rocked hard, nearly pitching one of them overboard, and then the beast hauled itself up, its claws raking across the deck with a wet scrape, its fur dripping in heavy clumps as seawater cascaded off its flanks and pooled across the planks. The men screamed warnings, scattering to different corners of the boat, but there was no space large enough to escape in the narrow deck, no barrier strong enough to withstand the full weight of the bear as it moved forward, rods snapping under its paws like brittle sticks. Marcus found himself closest, his hands gripping a fillet knife so small it felt useless in comparison to the predator bearing down on him. But instinct forced him to raise it anyway as the Kodiak lunged. The impact drove him backward, the swipe of a claw tearing open his thigh in one brutal slash that sent him sprawling, his legs spraying blood across the deck while he cried out in shock and pain, his body twisting as he tried to crawl away from the dripping jaws that loomed above him. The others reacted without thought, adrenaline pulling them into reckless defense. One man swung an oar, the wooden shaft cracking against the bear's shoulder, but doing little more than earning a furious bellow that echoed across the water. Another shoved a heavy cooler toward the animal, the plastic box skidding across the wet deck and momentarily slowing its advance, though the bear battered it aside with one sweep of its paw. Marcus lay bleeding, his knife clattering away as he clutched at his wound, his friends forced to stand between him and the predator with only the simplest tools they could grasp, their arms shaking from both fear and exertion as they pushed, jabbed, and shoved anything they could reach into the animal's path. The Kodiak reared up, towering over them even on the rocking boat, its roar vibrating through the timbers and into their bones, the sound deafening as it swung again, claws shredding an oar in two, the broken pieces tumbling into the sea. One of the men reached desperately for the flare gun mounted near the cabin, his slippery hands fumbling as he tried to load it, while the others screamed at him to hurry. The bear dropped back onto all fours, its muzzle wrinkled, its jaws snapping inches from their faces, the air hot with the stench of its breath, and still it pressed forward, undeterred by the splinters, the shoves, or the shouts. At last, the flare gun cracked with a burst of fire and smoke, the red flame streaking past the animal's face, close enough to singe wet fur, and the sudden blast of light startled it. The bear jerked back, its eyes reflecting the blaze, its massive body twisting awkwardly on the unsteady deck as it backed toward the stern, growling in protest, before finally turning and launching itself back into the water with a thunderous splash that sent waves lapping against the boat's sides. The men collapsed in exhaustion, gasping for air, their hands trembling uncontrollably as the silence of the sea rushed back in to fill the space where moments before there had only been violence and fear. The deck was a ruin, blood mixing with seawater in streaks that trailed toward the scuppers. Fishing rods were broken and coolers were overturned. The sharp tang of smoke from the flare lingered in the air. Marcus groaned, clutching his thigh as the others tore shirts and wrapped them tightly around the wound. Their voices choked as they worked frantically to stop the bleeding, their ears straining for any sound of the bear returning from the depths. Every shift of the waves seemed to echo with phantom movement, and every shadow on the waterline was another possible threat. Although the animal had retreated, the memory of its weight, its power, and its terrible roar hung heavy on them. When at last the engine coughed back to life and the boat shuddered forward toward the distant harbor, they remained silent, each man locked in his own thoughts, knowing how close they had come to being torn apart in a place they had thought safe. The Kodiak had reminded them in the most violent way possible that even the sea was no refuge from the reach of the largest bears on Earth, and that no catch, no matter how rich, was worth forgetting that truth. On August 12, 2023, a wooden platform stretched above the trees at the edge of the Carpathian Mountains, where visitors leaned over railings to admire rolling forests and hazy ridgelines. The hum of cable cars mixed with laughter as tourists unpacked snacks, resting before gondolas carried them higher into the peaks or back to the valley. The air smelled of fruit, bread, and cured meats, an inviting aroma of shared meals outdoors, drifting warmly into the wilderness that surrounded the lively gathering. No one saw the brown bear at first. The creature had moved silently through the undergrowth, its massive paws shifting leaves without a sound, its dark eyes locked on the commotion above, its nostrils flaring at the rich blend of human food. Then, in an instant that shattered the calm, the bear emerged from the tree line, its huge frame rising above the grass as it pushed forward onto the platform's edge. The sudden appearance froze the crowd, and for a heartbeat, the only sound was the creak of wooden planks under its weight. Then the panic erupted. Screams broke the stillness as people lunged for the gondolas, shoving bags and knocking over benches in their rush to escape. Children were yanked by their arms, dragged toward safety, while others clung desperately to the railing, too terrified to move. The bear, undeterred by the noise, barreled forward with surprising speed, swiping at a pile of unattended backpacks, sending straps and jackets tumbling across the deck. One of the bags burst open, scattering sandwiches wrapped in foil, the scent only intensifying its frenzy. Tourist Marco Ionescu, caught between instinct and fear, raised the tripod he had been using to steady his camera, holding it out like a makeshift barrier as the predator loomed over him. For a moment, it seemed as though the metal legs might keep the animal at bay, but with a sudden motion, the bear lashed out, its paw striking low and tearing across Marco's leg. He staggered backward as blood streamed down his shin, the wound deep and ragged, his face twisted in shock and pain as others screamed even louder at the sight. The bear shifted again, drawn now to a stack of food crates that vendors had left near the corner of the platform. With one sweep of its claws, it split the wooden slats, sending apples and bread rolls flying through the air, some bouncing off the planks, others tumbling down into the trees below. The predator lowered its head and tore through the mess, jaws snapping on fruit and tearing into packaging with a sound that echoed across the mountain. Meanwhile, the gondolas swayed as frightened families crammed inside, slamming doors shut and shouting for operators to move the cars faster. Some visitors crouched low behind benches, clutching children to their chests, their eyes darting toward the stairs as if calculating whether they could sprint down before the bear noticed them. The air grew thick with terror, the shouts overlapping, the pounding of feet on wood almost drowned out by the heavy breaths and guttural growls of the animal in their midst. Marco tried to crawl toward a bench, his injured leg dragging behind him, leaving a thin trail of blood across the planks. Two tourists pulled him by his arms, struggling to keep him upright as they inched toward the waiting gondola, every movement risking another charge. The bear, momentarily distracted by the crates, tore into bags and scattered wrappers like autumn leaves, its muzzle slick with juice and crumbs, oblivious to the chaos it had created. Then, above the panic, a piercing sound ripped through the air, the shrill wail of a ranger's flare as it was fired high into the sky. A streak of red light arced overhead before bursting in a flash, the hiss and crack echoing against the mountainside. The bear froze, head snapping upward, eyes catching the flare's glow, ears twitching as sparks drifted downward. A second flare followed, landing closer to the platform, hissing and sputtering on the ground, filling the air with the sharp stench of burning chemicals. At the same moment, an alarm blared from the station building, a harsh metallic wail that cut through the screams and reverberated off the forested slopes. The combination was enough to break the animal's frenzy. It snarled, snapping its jaws, backing slowly toward the railing as the crowd huddled in silence, watching every twitch of its body. With a final swipe that gouged deep claw marks into the wooden benches, the bear turned and bounded back toward the tree line, its heavy frame disappearing into the brush as swiftly as it had arrived. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the fading alarm and the distant crackle of the flare as it died in the grass. Then the silence was broken by cries of relief, sobs of fear, and shouts for medical help. Marco lay against the bench, his leg wrapped hastily in a torn shirt as volunteers pressed hard to slow the bleeding, his face pale, but his eyes wide open. Families huddled together, clutching children who still trembled, their gazes darting to the trees as if expecting the bear to return at any second. The once peaceful platform, designed to frame a panoramic view of mountains and valleys, had been transformed into a scarred reminder of how quickly human gatherings could lure the wild too close. Benches were splintered, crates destroyed, food smeared across the deck in pulp and crumbs, and claw marks carved into the wood like warnings left behind. Operators kept the gondolas running non-stop, ferrying shaken visitors down to the valley where ambulances waited. At the same time, rangers swept the perimeter with rifles and more flares in case the bear circled back. By nightfall, the mountain air grew cool again, and the stars appeared above the ridges. But the memory of the day's violence lingered heavier than the quiet. Those who had stood on the platform carried the vivid image of a massive brown bear storming into their midst, of a man bleeding on the wooden planks, of food scattered like confetti under the shadow of its bulk.